The voice memo was never meant for her ears. But when Delphine Moreau heard her husband call her a burden while praising his mistress, she didn't cry. She calculated, and what she did next didn't just end her marriage, it destroyed his entire world. Have you ever discovered something that completely rewrote your entire relationship? A text, a conversation, a moment that made you realize you were living a lie. Delphine thought she was building an empire with her husband. Instead, she was funding his affair, and he never saw the reckoning coming. If you've ever felt underestimated or taken for granted, you need to hear this. Hit that subscribe button, because this story will remind you exactly what you're worth. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Delphine's world split into before and after. The kind of morning that starts ordinary. Coffee brewing in the Italian espresso machine. Victor insisted they needed morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows of their Tribeca penthouse. The Hudson River glittering 30 stories below like scattered diamonds. Everything perfect. Everything a lie. Delphine was searching for a recipe she'd saved to their shared cloud drive. A lavender creme brulee she'd been planning to make for the dinner party they were hosting that weekend. Another performance in the 18-year theater of their marriage. Another night of her playing the gracious hostess while Victor played the visionary entrepreneur. Another evening of watching him hold court about deals and strategy and innovation, while she smiled and poured wine and made everyone comfortable. Her fingers moved across her laptop trackpad, scrolling through folders, looking for the file she'd saved last month. That's when she saw it. A folder she didn't recognize, labeled simply, 5 personal notes. She almost scrolled past it, almost continued her search for dessert recipes and party planning, almost stayed in the comfortable ignorance that had defined the last 2 years of her marriage. But something in her gut, that ancient feminine intuition her mother Giselle had always told her to trust, that voice that whispers when something is wrong, even when everything looks right, that instinct made her pause, made her click. Victor's voice filled the quiet morning kitchen like poison poured into clean water. Smooth, confident. The voice she'd woken up next to for nearly 2 decades. But the words were from a stranger. Honestly, I don't know why I keep dragging Delphine to these industry summits. She just stands there smiling like some ornament while I'm closing deals and building relationships that actually matter. Simone gets it. Simone sees the vision. She's hungry, she's sharp, and she doesn't need me to explain the difference between a Series A and a seed round. Delphine's hand froze on the trackpad. The kitchen suddenly too bright, too sharp. Every detail crystal clear, in a way that made her feel like she was watching her life from outside her body. There was a pause in the recording. The sound of ice clinking in a glass. Victor taking a drink of something. Whiskey, probably. He always drank whiskey when he was feeling successful. When he was celebrating himself. Delphine she's comfortable. She's safe. She's the golden ticket to her family's money. And that's about it. Without her last name and her trust fund, I'd have no reason to come home at night. But Simone makes me feel like the man I actually am, not some kept husband living off old money. The recording ended with a sharp click, leaving Delphine sitting in her designer kitchen in her multi-million-dollar penthouse wearing her silk robe and her diamond wedding band, staring at a laptop screen that had just destroyed everything she thought she knew. 18 years. 18 years of believing she was building something with this man. 18 years of supporting his dreams, hosting his clients, introducing him to her family's connections, writing checks for his business ventures, believing his promises about partnership, about love, about forever. 18 years, and he'd just called her an ornament, a golden ticket, a burden. She sat perfectly still, her café au lait growing cold beside her, the city humming 30 stories below, indifferent to the fact that her entire world had just fractured along a fault line she never knew existed. Cars honking, people rushing to work, the world continuing like nothing had changed, like everything hadn't just shifted on its axis. Delphine looked at her reflection in the dark laptop screen, high cheekbones inherited from her Haitian grandmother, deep brown eyes that had seen more boardrooms than most Fortune 500 executives, skin that glowed even without the expensive creams Victor's dermatologist recommended, a face she'd watched herself diminish in year after year, making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to a man who was building his ego on her foundation. Her mother's voice came back to her, clear as if Giselle Moreau was standing right there in the kitchen. Never let a man convince you that what you carry is too heavy. It is your weight to bear, and it is your power. Delphine had forgotten that commandment somewhere between the wedding vows and the slow, quiet erosion of her identity into Mrs. Victor Hale. She'd let him reshape her, convince her that her role was to support, to facilitate, to exist in the background while he shone in the light she was generating. She'd believed him when he said partnership meant division of labor. His work was business. Hers was everything else. She'd forgotten who she was before she became his wife, the woman who'd graduated top of her class at Wharton, who'd grown her family's investment portfolio by 300% in 5 years, who'd started a foundation that had educated thousands of young women across the Caribbean and West Africa, who'd sat across negotiating tables from men twice her age and walked away with exactly what she wanted. That woman was still in there, under the layers of accommodating, of dimming, of making herself digestible to a man who apparently found her so unbearable he had to vent to a voice recorder. Delphine closed the laptop slowly. Her hands were trembling, but her jaw was set. She looked around the kitchen she'd designed, the marble countertops she'd chosen, the custom cabinets she'd commissioned from a craftsman in Morocco, the art on the walls she'd collected from galleries in Paris and Lagos and Port-au-Prince. Every beautiful thing in this home had been selected by her, paid for by her, created with her vision and her money. Victor had contributed his presence, his opinions, his belief that her taste was refined because he'd refined it, his assumption that everything they had was somehow his achievement, his comfort in a life he could never have afforded on his own. She stood up from the kitchen island, smoothed down her silk robe, walked to the window, and looked out at the city she loved, the city her mother had conquered with nothing but talent and courage and an unshakable belief in her own worth, the city that didn't care who you were yesterday, only who you chose to be today. Before we go any further, do me a favor. If you're already invested in Delphine's story, tap that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Delphine didn't cry. She wanted to. God, how she wanted to collapse onto the cool kitchen floor and let the grief swallow her whole. But grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. Not until the walls she needed to build were fortified so completely that Victor Hale would shatter against them like glass against granite. She pulled out her phone. It wasn't even 8 in the morning yet. Victor was still asleep in their bedroom, probably dreaming about Simone, about being the man he actually was, instead of the kept husband he resented being, completely unaware that his wife had just discovered the truth, completely unprepared for what was coming. Delphine made 4 phone calls before the coffee in her cup went completely cold. The first was to Margot Fontaine, her family's attorney, a woman so formidable that opposing counsel had been known to settle cases simply upon learning she was involved. Margot had handled Moreau family legal matters for over 30 years. She'd drawn up Delphine's prenuptial agreement against Victor's protests about trust and love, and not needing legal protection in a real marriage. She'd been the one to tell young Delphine on the eve of her wedding that hope was beautiful, but documentation was smart. Margot answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for this call for years, as if she'd known this day would come eventually and had simply been patient. "It's time," Delphine said. No preamble, no pleasantries, just those 2 words that carried 18 years of weight. "I'll have a full team assembled by noon." Margot's voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of something that sounded like satisfaction. "The prenuptial agreement your mother insisted on is airtight, Delphine. He signed away claims to Moreau family assets, intellectual property, real estate holdings. Whatever he built on your foundation, and foundations can be removed." Delphine felt something settle in her chest. The first piece of architecture in the fortress she was building. Giselle Moreau had known. Her mother had looked at charming, successful Victor Hale and seen past the charisma to the opportunism underneath. She'd insisted on protections that, young in love, Delphine had thought were unnecessary, paranoid even, unromantic. Turned out, her mother had been protecting her from exactly this moment. The second call was to Oscar Whitfield, the financial strategist who had managed Moreau family wealth since before Delphine was born. Oscar was 73 years old, sharp as a scalpel, utterly loyal to the Moreau name. He'd taught Delphine about compound interest when she was 7, about market diversification when she was 12, about the difference between assets and liabilities when she was 15. He'd watched her grow from a trust fund baby into a serious investor with the kind of respect he rarely showed anyone. Oscar, I need a full accounting of every asset Victor has access to through me, every loan guarantee, every line of credit, every investment I've backed. I want it all mapped out by this afternoon. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not hesitation, just Oscar choosing his words carefully, the way he always did. Delphine, Oscar said gently, I've had that map prepared for 3 years. I was just waiting for you to ask for it. 3 years. Oscar had seen this coming 3 years ago, had quietly prepared for the day when Delphine would finally wake up to what everyone around her apparently already knew, that Victor Hale was a man living beyond his means on someone else's money, that the successful entrepreneur image was smoke and mirrors, that everything he had was borrowed or guaranteed or funded by the woman he called a burden. Send it to me, Delphine said, her voice steady now. All of it. I want to see exactly what I've been carrying. The third call was to her brother Remy, who lived in Paris and oversaw the European operations of Moreau Maison, the luxury house their mother had built from a single atelier in Port-au-Prince into a global empire spanning fashion and fine jewelry and real estate across 3 continents. Remy, who had stood at Delphine's wedding with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, who had bitten his tongue through 18 years of family dinners while Victor held court about his own genius, who had asked Delphine privately more than once if she was truly happy or just comfortable. She should have listened to her brother, should have paid attention to the way he watched Victor, the way he changed the subject whenever Victor started talking about his latest deal, the way he made sure to remind Delphine every time they spoke that she was brilliant, that she was capable, that she didn't need anyone to validate her worth. The phone rang 3 times before Remy picked up. It was early afternoon in Paris. He was probably in a meeting, probably reviewing designs or negotiating with suppliers or doing any of the 1,000 things required to run a global luxury brand. But when he heard Delphine's voice, he must have heard something in it, because his tone shifted immediately. I'm leaving him, Delphine said. Remy was silent for exactly 3 seconds, processing, understanding, preparing. Then his voice came back warm and certain and absolutely committed. What do you need from me? Everything, Delphine said. I need the board to know that Moreau Maison's partnership with Hale Dynamics is being dissolved. I need our European investors reassured that this is a strategic decision, not a crisis. And I need you here by Friday. I'll be on a plane tonight, Remy said without hesitation. Little sister. It's about time, little sister. He hadn't called her that in years, not since before the wedding, not since she'd started introducing herself as Mrs. Victor Hale instead of Delphine Moreau, not since she'd begun shrinking herself to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. The 4th call wasn't to anyone external. It was internal, a silent reckoning that took place as she stood in the shower, hot water streaming down her face, masking the tears she finally allowed to fall. This call was to herself, to the woman she'd been before Victor, to the girl who'd sat at her mother's knee, learning about legacy and power and the responsibility that came with both, to the ghost of who she'd become in the years of accommodating and diminishing and forgetting. She mourned in that shower, not for the man Victor was, but for the man she'd believed him to be, the partner who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and promised to protect her legacy, the husband who had looked into her eyes on their 10th anniversary and said, everything I have I owe to you. She thought he meant it romantically, poetically, a declaration of love and partnership. He'd meant it literally, everything he had. He owed to her, because without her money, her connections, her backing, he'd have nothing. The water ran cold before she finally stepped out, wrapped herself in a towel, looked at her reflection in the steam-covered mirror, and made a promise to the woman looking back at her. Never again would she make herself small for someone who didn't deserve her. Never again would she carry someone who called that carrying a burden. By 9 a.m, Victor emerged from the bedroom, hair perfectly styled, wearing the Tom Ford suit Delphine had bought him for his last birthday. smelling of the cologne she'd selected because she liked how it mixed with his skin. Everything about him curated by her, funded by her, made possible by her. While he complained to voice recorders about how she contributed nothing, "Good morning, beautiful." He kissed her cheek, a reflex, mechanical, the kind of kiss you give someone out of habit rather than desire. "Any coffee left?" "In the pot," Delphine said, her voice light, easy, the performance beginning. Because she wasn't ready for him to know yet, wasn't ready to show her hand before all the pieces were in place. Strategic patience, that's what this required. Not emotional reaction, but calculated response. Victor poured himself coffee, checked his phone, scrolled through emails with the self-important frown of someone who believed the world waited on his decisions. "Big day today," he said without looking up. "Meeting with potential investors for the Meridian project. Could be huge for the company." The company, Hale Dynamics, the tech consultancy he'd started 12 years ago with her money, that had grown into a mid-sized firm with her connections, that operated on credit lines she'd guaranteed and functioned in office space she'd co-signed for. His company, built entirely on her foundation, but existing in his mind as his achievement, his empire, his success. "That sounds exciting," Delphine said, pouring herself fresh coffee. "Will Simone be there?" She watched his face, carefully, looking for a tell, a flicker of guilt, recognition, anything that suggested he knew, she knew. But Victor's face remained smooth, confident, unconcerned. "Of course," he said. "Simone's been instrumental in putting this deal together. She really gets the vision, you know, sharp as they come." "I'm sure she is," Delphine said, her smile perfect, her voice warm, everything about her demeanor suggesting she was the same devoted wife she'd been yesterday, the same supportive partner who asked interested questions and celebrated his wins and never challenged his narrative about who was responsible for what. Victor finished his coffee, grabbed his briefcase, kissed her cheek again with the same mechanical affection. "I'll be late tonight. This meeting might run long, and then Simone and I need to prep for the Peterson contract revision." "Of course," Delphine said. "I'll see you when you get home." She watched him leave, listened to the elevator doors close, counted to 60 to make sure he was really gone, and then she opened her laptop to read the files Oscar had already sent. The financial picture was staggering. Oscar had compiled everything into a detailed report that read like an autopsy of her marriage. Every asset listed, every liability exposed, every truth she'd been avoiding for years laid out in spreadsheets and summaries that left no room for interpretation. Delphine's personal wealth, separate from the Moreau family trust, stood at approximately $700 million in liquid assets, investment properties, privately held equity. Her portfolio included real estate in Manhattan, Paris, Lagos, Port-au-Prince, commercial buildings, luxury residential developments, properties she'd purchased and managed through holding companies Victor didn't even know existed. Her charitable foundation, the one Victor dismissed as her hobby, her lane, had funded education for over 5,000 young women across the Caribbean and West Africa, scholarships, vocational training, entrepreneurship programs, small business loans. The foundation's endowment alone was worth $300 million, growing every year as Delphine quietly and brilliantly invested its assets. Her personal investment portfolio, the stocks and bonds and private equity stakes she'd accumulated over 15 years of careful strategic investing, had outperformed the market by 18% annually. 18%. Oscar had included a comparison chart showing how her returns stacked up against professional fund managers. She'd beaten 92% of them, while Victor thought she spent her days shopping and planning dinner parties. In total, including the family trust she'd inherited in full when she turned 50, Delphine Moreau was worth close to $2 billion. $2 billion. She wasn't just wealthy. She was one of the richest women in the state, and she'd been living like Victor Hale's dependent, like his accessory, like his burden. Oscar's report continued, now detailing Victor's actual financial position, and the contrast was devastating. Victor's personal savings, money he'd earned through salary from his company and kept in his own accounts, totaled $340,000, a respectable amount for most people, barely enough to cover 3 months of the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. His company, Hale Dynamics looked successful on paper. Revenue in the millions, high-profile clients, impressive growth trajectory. But Oscar had peeled back the layers. The company operated on $12 million in outstanding loans, every single one backed by Delphine's personal guarantee. His operating capital came from a revolving credit line that listed her as the primary guarantor, his office lease, his equipment financing, his expansion plans, all of it secured against her assets. If you're thinking Delphine should take him for everything, drop a comment below. Let's see if we're all on the same page about what happens next. Oscar's assessment was clinical and brutal. Victor Hale lives like a billionaire on your credit. Remove that credit, and he lives like a mid-level sales director with expensive taste and no way to pay for it. Delphine sat back in her chair, looking out at the Hudson River, at the city that had taught her mother that powerlessness was a choice, that the only person who could diminish you was yourself. That strength wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about knowing exactly what you were worth and refusing to accept less. She thought about all the times Victor had made her feel foolish for not understanding his business deals. All the times he'd explained things to her like she was a child who couldn't grasp complex concepts. All the board meetings where he'd suggested she didn't need to attend because the discussion would be too technical. All the investors he'd met with alone because her presence wasn't necessary. All of it. Every dismissal, every condescension, every subtle and not so subtle suggestion that she wasn't smart enough or business savvy enough to be a real partner. All of it coming from a man who had built exactly nothing on his own, who had taken her money, her connections, her backing, and convinced himself it was his genius that made it all work. The rage that filled her then wasn't hot, wasn't explosive. It was cold, calculated, the kind of anger that doesn't scream. It plans, it strategizes, it builds cases and gathers evidence and strikes with precision. Her phone buzzed. A message from Margot. Preliminary divorce documents ready for review. Would you like to come to the office this afternoon? Delphine typed back quickly. Yes, 2 o'clock. Another message, this one from someone she didn't recognize. A number Margot must have given her. The message was brief. Ms. Moreau, this is Claudette Voss. Margot Fontaine retained me to conduct a discreet investigation into your husband's activities. I have preliminary findings that require your immediate attention. Can we meet today? Delphine's heart rate picked up. An investigator. Margot had hired an investigator, without even being asked, because Margot knew, the same way Oscar knew, the same way Remy knew. Everyone around Delphine had been watching Victor, seeing him clearly, waiting for her to see him too. She responded. 3 o'clock. Margot's office. The rest of the morning passed in a strange suspension. Delphine moved through her routine, returning emails about foundation business, reviewing grant applications, confirming attendance at a charity gala next month. All the things that filled her days, the work Victor called her hobbies, the contributions he dismissed as less important than real business. She worked with a focus she hadn't felt in years. Every email she sent, every decision she made, every call she took, all of it suddenly crystal clear. This was her work. This was her impact. These thousands of women whose lives were changing because of her foundation. These investments that were generating wealth and creating opportunities. These networks she'd built across 3 continents. This was her empire, and she'd been letting someone else take credit for it while he called her a burden behind her back. At 1:30 she dressed for her meetings, not in the soft feminine clothes Victor preferred, not in the pastels and florals he said made her look elegant and appropriate. She dressed in power, a charcoal suit from Moreau Maison, her mother's final collection before she passed, cut so perfectly it felt like armor, sharp lines, strong shoulders, the kind of suit that announced you were not to be underestimated. Her grandmother's sapphire earrings, handed down through 4 generations of Moreau women who had built businesses and raised children and survived wars and revolutions and economic collapses, who had never once bowed to a man who didn't deserve their respect, who had taught their daughters that strength was their birthright and power was their responsibility. Heels that clicked against marble like a countdown, like a warning, like the sound of someone coming who would not be dismissed or diminished or convinced she was less than she was. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror, And for the first time in years, she saw herself clearly, not as Victor's wife, not as someone's accessory, but as Delphine Moreau, daughter of Giselle, granddaughter of Marie, heir to a legacy that had nothing to do with any man, and everything to do with the women who had refused to be anything less than extraordinary. Margot's office was in Midtown, 52nd floor of a building that overlooked Central Park. The reception area was all glass and steel and quiet wealth, the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were negotiated and empires were divided. Margot's assistant showed Delphine into the corner office where Margot was waiting, along with another woman, younger, sharp-eyed, wearing practical clothes and carrying a black leather portfolio. Delphine, Margot stood, embraced her warmly. "This is Claudette Voss, former federal agent, now the best private investigator in the city. I took the liberty of having her look into Victor's activities. What she found, you need to see." They sat at Margot's conference table. Claudette opened the black portfolio. Inside were photographs, documents, financial records, hotel receipts, all of it organized with the precision of someone building a prosecutable case. "I've been following Mr. Hale for 3 weeks, Claudette said, her voice professional, detached, presenting facts without judgment. "The affair with Simone Archer is extensive and well documented. They've been involved for a minimum of 2 years, possibly longer." She spread photographs across the table. Victor and Simone at expensive restaurants, holding hands across candlelit tables, walking into luxury hotels together during lunch hours. The Mark, the Greenwich, always booked under Simone's name, always charged to Hale Dynamics corporate accounts. More photographs. Victor and Simone in the parking garage of his office building, his hand on her waist, her face tilted up toward his, a kiss that was not professional, not appropriate, not the behavior of a man who came home to his wife every night and kissed her cheek out of mechanical habit. Delphine looked at the photographs, waiting for the pain, the heartbreak, the devastation of seeing visual proof that your husband loved someone else. But it didn't come. What she felt instead was vindication, clarity, the final piece of evidence that she wasn't crazy, wasn't paranoid, wasn't imagining things. This was real. He'd been lying, and now she had proof. Claudette continued, "The affair is damaging enough, but the financial misconduct is what will destroy him legally." She pulled out another set of documents, bank statements, expense reports, project budgets with discrepancies highlighted in yellow. "I traced corporate credit card charges over the past 2 years. Claudette said, "Romantic getaways billed as business trips, jewelry purchases totaling over $180,000, none of which appeared in your personal collection. Dinners at 5-star restaurants marked as client entertainment, but the reservation records show only 2 people, Mr. Hale and Ms. Archer. $180,000 in jewelry for another woman, charged to a company funded by Delphine's money, while Victor complained about the cost of her foundation work, while he sighed about charity galas being expensive, while he suggested maybe they should cut back on her discretionary spending. But this is the part that constitutes criminal activity." Claudette's voice hardened slightly. "Mr. Hale has been systematically inflating project budgets by 2005 to 35%. The excess is being transferred to a personal account that's funding his lifestyle with Ms. Archer. Conservative estimate based on the contracts I've reviewed. $3.4 million over the past 5 years. The room went very quiet. $3.4 million. Stolen, not borrowed, not mismanaged. Stolen from investments that Delphine had personally guaranteed, from a company that operated on her backing, while he called her a burden, while he told voice recorders that she contributed nothing. He'd been robbing her, systematically, for years." Claudette pulled out more documents. The Peterson project, budget padded by $800,000. The Meridian deal he was working on right now, $1.2 million in inflated costs already. Multiple smaller contracts with discrepancies adding up to hundreds of thousands. All of it siphoned off, all of it funding the life he was living with someone else. "Given that you're the primary investor and guarantor," Claudette said, "this constitutes embezzlement, fraud, theft. The district attorney's office would absolutely prosecute this. We're talking about serious prison time, 5 to 7 years minimum. Delphine looked at the evidence spread across the table, the photographs of intimacy, the receipts of betrayal, the financial records of theft, all of it documented, irrefutable, devastating. "Make copies," she said, her voice calm, steady. "Everything. One set for Margot, one for Oscar, and one for the district attorney's office." Margot nodded. "Delphine, I know this is painful, but you need to understand how strong your position is. The prenup your mother insisted on is airtight. Victor signed away any claim to Moreau family assets, to intellectual property derived from family connections, to real estate purchased with family money. He was so confident in his own earning potential, he barely read the fine print. He thought he was going to be the successful one." Delphine said quietly, "He thought my family's money was just seed capital, that eventually his genius would eclipse my inheritance, that he'd be the one supporting me instead of the other way around. Instead," Margot said gently, "he built a house of cards on your foundation, and when you remove the foundation, the house collapses." They spent the next hour reviewing the divorce petition. The document was thorough, clinical, devastating in its clarity. Victor would retain his personal items, his car, whatever salary his company could pay him after she withdrew her backing. Everything else, the penthouse, the investment properties, the art collection, the luxury items, all of it would remain with her, because all of it was hers, had always been hers, purchased with her money, titled in her name, protected by the prenup he'd signed without really believing he'd ever need to care about its terms. He might try to claim he contributed to building your wealth. Margot warned, judges sometimes award partial ownership based on emotional or supportive contributions to a marriage. Let him try. Delphine replied, "I have 18 years of financial records showing that every major asset was purchased with my money or my family's money. He never even co-signed on most of the investments. I have documentation of every check I wrote, every property I purchased, every business deal I backed. His name isn't on any of it, because I kept the Moreau name for business purposes. He wanted me to take his name socially, but keep mine professionally. Thought it gave him access to my family's network." Margot smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who knew she had an unwinnable case for the other side. His lawyers are going to have a very difficult time building anything for him. "When do we serve him?" Delphine asked. "That's your decision," Margot said. "We can do it privately. At home, just you and him and the process server. Or, Delphine looked up. "Or, we can do it publicly." Margot's eyes glinted. "At his office, in front of his colleagues, in front of Simone. Send a message that actions have consequences." Delphine thought about the voice memo, about Victor laughing with his friends about how she was just dead weight, about him praising Simone in front of other people while dismissing his wife as decoration, about 18 years of being patronized and diminished and treated like her contributions didn't matter. "Publicly," she said, "tomorrow, at his office. I want him to feel the same shock and humiliation I felt, and I want Simone to understand that being the other woman comes with consequences too." Margot nodded. "I'll arrange everything." Delphine left the office as the sun was setting over Central Park. The city was lighting up, buildings glowing against the darkening sky. She walked instead of calling her car, needing the movement, the cold October air, the reminder that the world was still turning, that life was still happening, that this ending was also a beginning. Her phone rang. Victor. She almost didn't answer, but she wasn't ready for him to suspect anything yet, so she picked up. "Hey babe." Victor's voice was cheerful, energized. "The meeting went amazing. The investors are really interested. Simone absolutely killed the presentation. We're grabbing dinner to celebrate. Don't wait up. Dinner with Simone to celebrate. Using Delphine's money to wine and dine his mistress, while his wife walked through Central Park, processing the discovery that her entire marriage was a performance." "That's wonderful," Delphine said, her voice warm. "Congratulations. You and Simone make quite a team." "We really do," Victor said, and Delphine could hear the smile in his voice, the satisfaction, the complete lack of guilt or awareness. "She gets the vision, you know? It's like working with someone who's on your wavelength." "I'm sure it is," Delphine said. "Enjoy your dinner." She hung up, kept walking. past the fountain where street musicians were playing, past the couples holding hands and tourists taking photos and hot dog vendors packing up for the night. All of it normal, ordinary, the beautiful mundane chaos of a city that didn't care about her broken heart or her husband's betrayal or the reckoning that was coming. Tomorrow morning, Victor would go to work, expecting another normal day, another round of meetings and strategy sessions and building his empire on her foundation. He'd sit in his corner office with its view of lower Manhattan. He'd probably have coffee with Simone. They'd probably laugh about something, make plans for their next hotel rendezvous, feel smug and successful and completely untouchable. And then Delphine would walk in with a process server, with divorce papers, with evidence of embezzlement, with the full weight of Moreau family power behind her, and his entire world would detonate. She smiled as she walked. It wasn't a happy smile, wasn't vindictive exactly. It was the smile of someone who had finally stopped making herself small, who had finally remembered what she was capable of, who was about to remind everyone else, too. The morning of reckoning arrived, wrapped in October fog, the kind that makes the city look like a dream. Buildings emerging from white, like they're not quite solid, not quite real. Delphine woke at 5, 2 hours before Victor's alarm. She'd barely slept, but her mind was crystal clear. She felt the way soldiers must feel before a battle. Calm, focused, ready. She showered in the guest bathroom, the one she'd moved to 3 nights ago, claiming the master bathroom's plumbing was acting up, and she didn't want to disturb Victor's sleep. He'd accepted the explanation without question, probably relieved to have the bed to himself, probably texting Simone about how his wife was finally giving him space. She dressed with the precision of a general preparing for war. The charcoal Moreau maison suit again, the one that made her feel invincible, a crisp white shirt, her grandmother's sapphire, earrings catching the early morning light, heels that clicked against the hardwood floor like a metronome, like a countdown, like a warning of something unstoppable coming. She looked at herself in the mirror, really looked. For years she'd seen herself through Victor's eyes, pretty, elegant, appropriate, an accessory to his ambition, decoration for his achievements. Today she saw herself through her own eyes, through her mother's eyes, through the eyes of 4 generations of Moreau women who had built empires and raised children and survived everything the world threw at them. She saw power. She saw strength. She saw a woman who had forgotten herself for too long and was about to remember exactly who she was. Victor emerged from the master bedroom at 7, already dressed, already checking his phone, already existing in his world where Delphine was peripheral, background noise. The woman who kept the household running while he did the important work. Big day today, he said, not looking up from his email. Final pitch to the Ashworth Delacroix Group. If we close this, the Meridian project is fully funded. The Meridian project, the one where he'd already padded the budget by $1.2 million, the one he was planning to use to steal from her while she smiled and played the supportive wife. That sounds important, Delphine said, pouring coffee she had no intention of drinking. Will Simone be presenting with you? Of course. Victor said, she's been integral to the whole thing. Can't do it without her. Can't do it without her. But he could do it without his wife, without the woman whose money made everything possible, whose connections opened every door, whose backing gave him credibility. She was optional, disposable, a burden. Good luck, Delphine said, kissing his cheek, the same mechanical affection he'd been giving her. I hope it goes well. Thanks, babe. Victor grabbed his briefcase, headed for the elevator, completely unaware that he was walking into the last normal day of his life. Delphine waited until she heard the elevator doors close, counted to 100, then called her driver. Time to go. The process server was waiting in the lobby of Hale Dynamics building. Her name was Diane. Margot had selected her personally. A woman in her 50s, composed, professional, the kind of person who could deliver devastating news with absolute calm. Ready, Ms. Moreau? Diane asked. More than ready, Delphine replied. They took the elevator to the 20th floor. Hale Dynamics occupied the entire level. Glass walls, open floor plan, the modern tech aesthetic that Victor loved, that he'd designed with her money, that existed because she'd co-signed the lease. Employees looked up as Delphine walked through. They knew her, the boss's wife, the elegant woman who came to company parties, who wrote checks for office upgrades, who smiled and asked polite questions about their work. They had no idea she was the reason they had jobs, that their paychecks depended on her continued financial backing, that the company they worked for was about to implode. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, she could see Victor. He was mid-presentation. 4 people sat around the table. 2 men, 2 women, the potential investors, Mr. Ashworth, Ms. Delacroix, 2 others she didn't recognize. They were all watching Victor intently as he gestured at a slide deck, as he commanded the room the way he always did, confident, charismatic, completely in his element. And there, at his right hand, was Simone Archer, sleek, polished, wearing a red dress that was too tight and too low for a business meeting, her hand resting on the conference table, just slightly too close to Victor's, her eyes tracking his every movement with an attention that was professional, but also something more, something possessive. Delphine waited. She let Victor finish his pitch. Let him shake hands with the investors. Let him bask in their interest and approval. Let him think this was going to be another win, another deal closed, another step in building the empire he thought was his. The investors emerged from the conference room. Delphine intercepted them with the grace of a woman who had been navigating high society since before she could walk. Mr. Ashworth, Ms. Delacroix, how wonderful to see you both. I believe we met at the Met Gala last spring. Mr. Ashworth's face lit up with recognition. Ms. Moreau, of course. Your foundation's scholarship program was the talk of the evening. Magnificent work you're doing. You're too kind, Delphine said, her smile warm, genuine. I hope Victor has been transparent about the financial structure of Hale Dynamics. As the primary guarantor of the company's lending portfolio, I always appreciate when investors have the full picture. The silence that followed was surgical, precise, exactly what she'd intended. Miss Delacroix's smile faltered slightly. Mr. Ashworth's eyes narrowed. They were experienced investors. They understood subtext. They heard what she wasn't saying, that the money behind this company was hers, that it might not be there tomorrow. That due diligence was about to get very complicated. We'll certainly look into all the details. Ms. Delacroix said carefully, thank you for the insight, Ms. Moreau. They left with considerably less enthusiasm than they'd arrived with. Delphine watched them go, watched their investment in Victor's vision evaporate in real time. Then she turned toward the conference room where Victor was celebrating with Simone, his hand on the small of her back, their laughter carrying through the glass walls, comfortable, intimate, completely unaware. Diane stepped beside her. Ready? Delphine opened the conference room door without knocking. Victor's head snapped up. His hand dropped from Simone's back, but not quickly enough. Not before Delphine saw, not before several employees watching from their desks saw. Delphine, what are you doing here? Victor Hale. Diane stepped forward, her voice formal, professional. You are being served with a petition for divorce. A formal demand for repayment of all loans personally guaranteed by Ms. Delphine Moreau, and notification of a forensic financial audit being conducted in coordination with the district attorney's office regarding suspected embezzlement of investor funds. The envelope landed on the conference table with the weight of a verdict, with the finality of a door closing, with the sound of a life ending. Victor's face cycled through confusion to shock to terror in the space of 3 heartbeats. Simone backed away from him, as though proximity itself had become dangerous, as though his destruction might be contagious. Delphine, wait. Victor started, his voice rising, panicked. We can talk about this at home. You don't need to. You called me a burden, Victor. Delphine's voice was steady, warm almost, like a mother explaining something obvious to a child. You said I was nothing but a pretty face and a family name. You said Simone understood you in ways I never could. She turned to Simone, whose face had gone the color of ash, whose perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked garish against her pallor. Did he tell you he was separated? Delphine asked, that I was just there for appearances? Simone's silence was its own confession, her eyes dropping to the floor, her hands clutching her tablet like a shield that couldn't protect her. He told you what you needed to hear to stay convenient. Delphine continued, just like he told me what I needed to hear to keep writing checks. She turned back to Victor, who was gripping the edge of the conference table, as though the floor might give way, as though gravity itself had become unreliable. The loft is in my name. The cars are in my name. Your company's $12 million in outstanding loans are backed by my assets, and I am calling them in. You have 30 days. She let that sink in. Let him do the math. Let him realize that 30 days from now, his company would be bankrupt. His lifestyle would be gone. His image as a successful entrepreneur would be revealed as the fiction it always was. Your personal account holds roughly $340,000. Delphine said, I'd recommend a good financial planner, though I suspect Simone's strategic brilliance doesn't extend to budgeting for one-bedroom apartments. Several employees beyond the glass walls had stopped even pretending to work. They were watching openly now, witnessing the destruction of their boss, the revelation that everything they thought they knew about Hale Dynamics was built on one woman's money, and that woman was taking it all back. Oh, and Victor. Delphine moved toward the door, then stopped. One final detail. The voice memo you recorded about what a burden I am. You saved it to our shared cloud drive. For a tech genius that was remarkably careless. She walked out, Diane following behind her, the conference room silent except for the sound of Victor trying to breathe, trying to process, trying to understand how his perfect life had just detonated. In the elevator, Delphine leaned against the mirrored wall, let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like years. She was not triumphant, not vindictive. She was free. The weight she'd been carrying, the burden of making herself small, of accommodating, of believing she was less important than she was, all of it lifting away like fog in morning sun. Her phone buzzed. A text from Remy landed at JFK. Where do you need me? She typed back, the penthouse, bring champagne, the good kind. Another text from Margot. His lawyers will call by end of day. They have nothing. You have everything. And finally, Oscar. The Moreau Foundation received 3 new partnership inquiries today. Word travels fast. You're not just wealthy, Delphine. You're influential. It's time you stopped hiding that. Delphine stepped out of the elevator into the bright October morning. The fog had burned away, leaving the city sharp and gleaming in the autumn sun. She didn't hail her car. She walked down the avenue, past the flower sellers and coffee carts and ordinary miracles of a city that didn't care who you were yesterday, only who you chose to be today. For 18 years, she had made herself small. She had folded her ambitions into neat squares and tucked them away in drawers labeled supportive wife and gracious hostess and the woman behind the man. She had let Victor stand in the light she generated, never once asking for credit, never once demanding recognition, because she believed that love meant disappearing into someone else's story. But she was no one's subplot. She never had been. Her mother's voice returned to her, carried on the autumn wind, clear as if Giselle was walking beside her. Never let a man convince you that what you carry is too heavy. It is your weight to bear, and it is your power. It wasn't heavy. It had never been heavy. It was hers. The weight of legacy, of brilliance, of 700 million reasons to stand tall. And she was done carrying it for someone who called it a burden. 1 month later, the city had moved on, the way cities do. New scandals, new successes, new stories to tell. But for the people involved in the Hale-Moreau divorce, as it was being called in legal circles, the aftermath was still unfolding. Victor's company had filed for bankruptcy. Delphine had called in the $12 million in loans as promised. Hale Dynamics had exactly zero ability to repay. The company had been liquidated, assets sold, employees laid off. The whole operation dissolved in less than 30 days. Turns out, when you remove the foundation, the house collapses quickly. Victor himself was living in a studio apartment in Queens, his luxury lifestyle gone, his reputation destroyed, criminal charges pending for embezzlement and fraud. The district attorney's office had built a case based on Claudette's evidence. 5 to 7 years was the likely sentence. His lawyers were advising him to plead out, take a deal, hope for leniency. Simone Archer had been fired, not just from Hale Dynamics, but blacklisted in the finance and tech industries. When the embezzlement came to light, her role became impossible to ignore. She'd signed off on the inflated budgets, had helped conceal the theft. Whether she'd known the full extent was debatable, but her career was over either way. Last Delphine heard she was working retail, trying to figure out how to rebuild a professional life from ashes. The affair hadn't survived poverty. Turned out Simone's love for Victor was closely tied to his perceived success. When the money disappeared, so did she. Victor was facing prison alone, living in a 400-square-foot apartment alone, processing the reality that the woman he'd called a burden had been the only thing keeping him afloat. Meanwhile, Delphine's transformation was the kind of story business magazines loved. Forbes had run a profile, the billionaire who was hiding in plain sight. They detailed her investment acumen, her foundation's impact, the Moreau family legacy, and her decision to step into a more public role as a leader rather than a silent partner. She'd taken an active position in Moreau Maison, working alongside Remy to expand their sustainable luxury initiatives. She'd launched a new investment fund focused exclusively on women-led businesses. The applications had flooded in. Entrepreneurs who'd been overlooked by traditional venture capital suddenly had access to not just money, but mentorship and connections. Her foundation had expanded operations to 10 countries. The education programs were now supporting over 10,000 women annually. She'd been invited to speak at the United Nations, at Davos, at conferences where policymakers and philanthropists gathered to discuss how to actually create change rather than just talk about it. She was no longer Mrs. Victor Hale, no longer someone's wife, someone's accessory, someone's burden. She was Delphine Moreau, billionaire investor, philanthropist, leader, the woman her mother had raised her to be before she'd forgotten. The penthouse in Tribeca became her permanent home. She'd had it redecorated, removing every trace of Victor's presence. The art he'd claimed to love but never really understood. The furniture he'd insisted on that had never felt quite right. All of it gone, replaced with pieces that reflected her actual taste, her actual vision, her actual life. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Delphine went too far or not far enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who was benefiting from you? Tell your story below. This community has your back. And here's a big one. What would you do with $700 million after a betrayal like this? Let's dream big in the comments. Look, we're building something here at Mr. Black Love Stories. This isn't just entertainment. It's empowerment. Every story we tell has a lesson. Every lesson has the power to change someone's life. Maybe that someone is you. Because here's what Delphine's story teaches us. First, know your worth. Not what others tell you you're worth. What you've actually built, earned, created. Your contributions aren't invisible. They're foundational. And when people take them for granted, that says everything about them and nothing about you. Second, document everything. Prenuptial agreements aren't about distrust. They're about clarity and protection. Giselle Moreau's foresight saved Delphine. Financial literacy is self-defense. Know where your money goes. Know what you're signing. Know what you're guaranteeing. Because the people who love you won't ask you to sign away your protection. The people who are using you will. Third, strategic patience beats emotional reaction every time. Delphine didn't confront Victor the moment she heard that voice memo. She gathered evidence, built her case, assembled her team, then executed perfectly. Emotional intelligence means knowing when to act and how to act. It means understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until you're unbeatable. What not to do, though? Don't confront without evidence. Don't make threats you can't execute. Don't let emotions override strategy. And don't ever settle for less than you deserve. Delphine didn't take $700 million and walk away. She took what was always hers. Victor didn't lose his wife. He lost his bank. He lost his credibility. He lost his access to a life he could never have afforded on his own. That's the difference between earning and taking, between partnership and parasitism, between love and exploitation. Her 18 years weren't wasted. They were an education. She learned exactly who she was without him. Turned out, she was extraordinary. The burden didn't walk away. The blessing did. And it took everything, because everything was hers. The house, the money, the connections, the power, all of it built by her, maintained by her, made possible by her. Victor had contributed his presence, his opinions, his assumption that access meant ownership. And when she revoked that access, he had nothing, because he'd never had anything. He'd been living in her house, spending her money, taking credit for her vision, and calling her a burden while he did it. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Delphine was in Paris, meeting with European investors about expanding Moreau Maison's presence in emerging markets. The meeting was in a centuries-old building overlooking the Seine, the kind of place where history felt alive in the stones. She was presenting a 5-year growth strategy when her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her look. It was from Victor, the first contact since the divorce. The message was short. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand what I had until I lost it. You deserved better than what I gave you. I hope you're happy." Delphine read it twice, waiting for the old feelings to surface. The love she'd once felt, the hurt from his betrayal, the anger at his theft, but none of it came. What she felt instead was something closer to pity for a man who had held something precious and treated it like a burden until it was too late to recognize his mistake. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say, nothing that would change what had happened or who they'd become. Instead, she put her phone away, turned her attention back to the investors who were waiting, who valued her expertise, who saw her brilliance, who wanted to partner with her because of what she could do, not because of what she could give them. That evening, she had dinner with Remy at a small bistro in the Marais. They talked about business, about family, about their mother, and how proud she would be to see what they'd built, how Giselle had always known that Delphine was capable of extraordinary things, how she just needed to remember it herself. "You know what Mom used to say," Remy said over wine. "A woman who knows her worth doesn't need anyone else to validate it. She just needs to stop letting other people diminish it." Delphine raised her glass to Mom, and to never being anyone's burden again. They drank to that, to liberation, to clarity, to the sweet freedom of being exactly who you were meant to be, without apology or accommodation. When Delphine returned to New York, she found herself walking through Central Park on a Sunday morning, the same path she'd walked the night she learned about Victor's betrayal, the same route she'd taken while processing the discovery that her marriage was a lie. But everything felt different now, lighter. The autumn had turned to winter, and now to spring. The trees were budding, flowers blooming in the gardens, the city renewing itself the way it always did, the way she had. She passed the fountain, where street musicians played, past the couples holding hands and the tourists taking photos and the vendors selling hot dogs and pretzels. All of it ordinary, beautiful, the miracle of a city that kept moving forward, no matter what. Her phone buzzed, a notification from the foundation. Another batch of scholarship recipients had been selected, 25 young women from across the Caribbean and West Africa who would have their education funded, who would have opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise, who would go on to build businesses and support families and change their communities. 25 women who existed in the world differently because Delphine had remembered her power, because she'd stopped making herself small, because she'd walked away from someone who couldn't see her value and walked toward the life she was meant to live. That's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not even justice, but revelation. The revelation that you are not defined by how other people see you, that your worth is not determined by whether someone appreciates it, that the most powerful thing you can do is remember exactly who you were before someone convinced you to forget. If this story spoke to you, you need to subscribe. We drop stories like this every week. Stories about people who refused to stay small, who chose themselves when everyone else chose against them, who walked away with their power intact. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because your worth isn't negotiable, and we're here to remind you of that. Remember, you're not a burden to the right people. You're a blessing, and if someone can't see that, take your 700 million, or your value, whatever that looks like for you, and walk away. The right people will chase what you're worth. The wrong ones will call you a burden while picking your pockets. Choose yourself every single time. I'm Mr. Black Love Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.